Great to be with you, Ash.
Yeah, looking forward to our chat. Chad, what I thought I'd do today is we would kick off our talk with just a little bit about yourself, for those that don't know. So my name's Ashley Hall, and I'm joined today by Travis Gale. Travis, basically, our interview for today, and a little bit about Travis. He, at the age of 18, decided to spend a year traveling around the world, 17,000 kilometers in 4 continents, and he raised 1.7 million for vulnerable children. And from what I understand, Trav, this is where you basically penned a vision for the organization which you're now director of, which is Apple Tree. So you're director of Apple Tree, which has a focus on organizational culture and provides consulting and coaching services to businesses. And then also, which is quite exciting, you're the author of the book, The Middle, which we're going to delve into a little bit today. So that's just a little bit about you, Trav. So really the context of today's conversation is we're talking about resilience, as the title was. And if we look at the backdrop, we all know about COVID-19 and the effect it's had on business. And even before COVID, we were already, as business owners, we were already operating in a very challenging landscape. We had the flailing economy, if we could say that. We've got load shedding to deal with, the strength of the rand, the diversity agenda to consider, tax, high expenses. Bottom line is that there's never been a time where we've needed to be more resilient. And actually, when we titled this interview today, Trav, I mentioned resilience, and you actually said to me a more accurate term would actually be endurance. So I'd like to tee you up there, and if you could just chat to us a little bit more about the term endurance, and then we can dig into what resilience actually means.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ash. Well, good to be with you and with the community. To dive straight into it, I define endurance as the ability to keep going, and especially in the midst of challenging circumstances or tough circumstances without giving way. And I know that we're speaking to a faith community here, so there's that pertinent scripture in Hebrews 12 verses 2, which talks about being surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. And if you look into the word, you see people that were able to run the race that was marked out for them with endurance. And that's what the scripture tells us to do. It says, lay aside every weight and run the race that's marked out for us with endurance. So endurance is about being fixed on a goal. It's been fixed on a calling. It's been fixed on a destination, but it's been able to navigate anything that comes your way, and to not give up, to not give in, and to reach those finishes. So that's the kind of key concept of endurance, but it is definitely flanked by and mixed in with these concepts of grit and resilience and resolve.
Okay.
To speak, yeah.
Okay, let's hear a little bit about resilience, grit, and resolve, because I always kind of thought resilience and endurance were almost the same thing. But as you mentioned those terms, already I'm starting to think quite differently. Yeah,
and they definitely have got some strong, crossovers. They've got some uniqueness as well. So grit, one of the definitions that I really like to use is a definition that was coined by Angela Duckworth. She wrote some really good writing around grit, and her definition is passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And it's a really interesting definition, because when a lot of people think about grit, they think about the idea of just staying the course, taking on the burden, taking on the weights, but just moving through and the grind in many respects. But I love the fact that she included passion, because it's not just about reaching the finishes and navigating the tough times. It's also about our ability to enjoy the journey, find fulfillment in the journey. We're not teed up to just be a people that just has to endure a whole lot of difficult circumstances to reach the finish. We're also called to be a people that shows joy and satisfaction and finds fulfillment in that journey as well. So grit tees us up to talk about resilience, because resilience is for me, it's a phenomenal concept, in that it's about the ability for people, for communities, to maintain core purpose and integrity despite any unforeseen shocks or any pressurized situations. It's a very similar definition to an author by the name of Andrew Zolli. So in many respects, resilience is often spoken about as the ability to bounce back. I believe so much in what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, who I'm doing it for, that no matter what comes my way, I'll bounce back. I'll take on the shock, I'll take on the brunt, but I'll keep going. And you can see our grit and resilience have got slightly different nuances, but very, very similar. And they underpin almost and are foundational to endurance. And then the third one, Ash, is a lovely word. It's resolve. And I love that term, strengthen your resolve. You know, it's about the idea of deciding firmly on a course of action. I think if like the related scripture for me would be, let your yes be yes and your no be no. It's this idea of, I've decided I'm going in this direction. I'm clear on the fact that this is the direction I must walk. And so therefore I've got a firm determination to move that way. And so those three things, grit and resilience and resolve, sit as foundational principles for the ability to endure and to run this race that's marked out for us.
That's excellent, Trev. I know we referenced earlier the book, The Middle, and in that book, you actually talk about your own journey in this regard. And I really love it when, you know, a speaker like yourself has got a story to tell. Do you want to tell us a little about the journey that you've had and how you came to writing the book, The Middle?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as you mentioned, I was very privileged to be invited on what was a round the world bicycle tour. The year that finished after I finished matric in 1998. So we spent 1999 cycling across 4 continents to, as you mentioned, raise 1.7 million rand for children living with and affected by HIV and AIDS. And it's important to note that when I went into that experience, I wasn't a first team anything with regard to sports. I certainly wasn't an A student, and I didn't have any cycling background either. So it was a real school of endurance for me in learning what it means to navigate this journey. And since I've got back from that tour, I've often told stories, and I very rarely talk about the start and the finish, even though those 2 days were significant. But really, the story was written in the middle. So the middle is where the highs and lows were having to be dealt with, where we experienced the challenges, where we experienced the doubts, where we experienced the difficulties from a relational point of view. All that stuff went into this middle piece. And about 4 years ago, I realized that for the last 15 years, what I'd been doing is applying the same insights that I applied to navigate the middle of the cycle tour and reach the finish into every other middle that I've had to walk since then. So since I got back from the tour, I pitched up at the start of my studies at University of KwaZulu-Natal. I pitched up at the start of living overseas for a year. I pitched up at the start of my relationship with my wife. I pitched up at the start of our marriage. I pitched up at the start of our parenting. And then, of course, we all pitch up at the start lines of entrepreneurship, brand building, even our sporting endeavors, and then, of course, our faith, and sometimes our leadership in those areas. So every single one of us are constantly pitching up at start lines. We want to reach the finish, but in order to reach the finish, we have to navigate the middle. And so the middle book and brand is essentially a consolidation of the key stories and insights that I've used to leverage and to be able, so that I've leveraged, to be able to navigate the middle as best as I can. And it was just my way of really encouraging and enabling other people to do the same.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was chatting to an established business owner the other day, and he was just saying, we live in this age of instant gratification, and there's all these startup companies that you hear about in the media that make huge money very quickly, and there's a lot of books about, you know, how to get started and really focusing on the goal, but not a huge amount of focus on the middle. And this entrepreneur that I was speaking to was just saying that the idea of, you know, starting a business and being successful in 1 year is, you know, it's not a reality. Even 2 years, often people used to talk about 2 years, but now he's saying, you know, a really good business, you're looking at 3 to 5 years. And the success of the business isn't necessarily determined by how you start. It's obviously really important, but it's what happens in the middle, which is what you're really talking about.
Yeah, and if I can say, Ash, I mean, I always put this disclaimer in. I think, you know, having had the experience of cycling around the world, I can honestly say that challenge was far easier than trying to navigate 15 years of entrepreneurship. There's been times in my marriage and my parenting and just being a citizen of South Africa where I'd rather be cycling around the world. So all of us have got tricky middles to have to navigate, and it's at times very difficult. But I do see a lot of people dropping off, you know, and I think for me, my passion and my heart is to see people stay the course, especially when it comes to our calling, and not give up, you know, but to keep going.
Yeah, and what I found interesting is that I remember talking to someone about entrepreneurship, and what I realized was that a lot of people think that if you're an entrepreneur, it's this mythical kind of character where you're born with this entrepreneurship, where actually it's a skill. And what you're talking about here is really in the middle, you need to have specific skills to deal with it. Now, if we look at your book, you mentioned 7 key insights really into the middle. Do you want to elaborate on a few of those? We don't have time to go through all of them, but maybe you can chat through a few of those today.
Yeah, sure. So resilience and grit and resolve, this whole concept of endurance, it's about developing an ecosystem in your life. And I think when it comes to entrepreneurship, especially, it's very important for entrepreneurs to develop an ecosystem that's going to support their ability to endure. So it's a mistake to think that endurance is purely just about getting up every day and keep going, you know.
Sorry to interrupt there. So I think a lot of people think that people are born with endurance, or he's just a resilient type character. In your experience, is this true?
No, it's definitely something that can be developed. In fact, I'm working on a bit of an article at the moment where I talk about forced endurance versus willful endurance. And the reality is that many people in our country are forced to endure by nature of their circumstances. If they don't endure, they won't survive. But for us, we've got the ability to actually choose activities that require endurance. So the more we can stretch ourselves, the more we can place ourselves in challenging circumstances, the more we develop endurance in our own lives. And to be honest, I think this is how God parents us, and that he doesn't give us everything easy and on a platter. And he calls us to dig deep, and to learn more about who we are and to develop that ecosystem that's going to support our ability to endure. We know that everyone biblically didn't have it easy. They had to navigate very trying circumstances. So as entrepreneurs, it's so important for us to recognize that the ecosystem is as important as the goal. And the reality is that the challenging circumstances are never going to stop coming our way.
For sure. So going back to those key insights, we were just getting into those in our sidetrack sheet. If we had to name a few which you think were take-homes for today, what would those be?
Yeah, so I'll start off with the first two that are in the book. Each story is linked to a day on the tour. So, and then that day is linked to an insight. But I think the first chapter and the first insight for me is really one that sticks with me, and it's called the Day 5 chapter. And so really, if I can paint the picture, I was exceptionally excited about this course-driven adventure. I was expectant and had a huge amount of anticipation to get out there into the world, to experience cultures, and then of course to be able to raise funds for the children. And there's a picture of me on the 31st of December, absolutely elated because I was about to pitch up at the start line. And I think this is very true for all of us, is that especially as entrepreneurs, we stand at the start line of a new brand, of a new vision, of a new idea. We stand at the start lines of new relationships, and we've got this perception of what's to come, and it fills us with good feelings. Nobody dislikes standing on a new start. And so for the first 4 days, I was wrapped up in the whole experience of it all. And people were stopping and taking photos with us because we'd been on the news and on 5FM with Mark Gilman at the time. And so this kind of good feelings were all a part of the mix. But on the 5th day, day 5, I had to cycle between Bloemfontein and Tromsburg, which was about 123 kilometers. And 30 Ks into that ride, the weather just changed. I experienced like a massive headwind. It was exceptionally hot. We also entered onto the N1 at that time where we'd been on the back roads. The terrain got quite boring. Nobody was stopping. It was just cars flying by us on the highway. And for the first time, I began to have some serious doubts about my ability to reach the finish, let alone, the whole tour, just getting to Tromsburg. And I began to,
It's a business, so Trav, that must be, I think anyone who's been an entrepreneur at some stage, this happens in business.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the insight, is that every single start since that day has been followed by a day 5. So basically my belief is that no matter what you start, you're going to reach the day 5 moment where the circumstances aren't what you expected to see. And the difference between your reality and what you expected, there's a chasm. And that space that you're standing in is exceptionally difficult, because what I experienced on the tour and on my entrepreneurship journey and my other journeys is you get filled with doubt. You start asking questions about your ability to do what you're doing. You start asking questions about whether or not this was the right thing that you even decided to do in the first place. Yeah. And those questions can cause you to enter into a victim mentality and can cause you to paralyze. So the key insight for me is that in the midst of those things, momentum is your friend. If I was to just give up and throw my bike down on the side of the road, then I'm basically standing on the side of the road with nowhere to go. So at key points in my entrepreneurship journey, I've been exceptionally deflated. I've been full of doubts around whether or not this is the right path for me. I've gone back on my decisions and gone, geez, did I make the right decision? But the most important thing to do in the midst of that day 5 moment is not to stop, but to maintain momentum. And there's been months where I've pitched up, put my clothes on, got to work, done what I've needed to do, even though I was completely disengaged. But that momentum was what essentially popped me out into a different space.
Yeah,
So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
I was actually reading a sales book, and what the author was talking about, he said, was at some stage and after your initial launch of sales of a product, you're going to hit a plateau. And he said it's at that time that you don't stop and give up. At that time, you actually got to refocus, and maybe not necessarily focus on sales and numbers, but focus on relationship with customers and build networks. So you just shift your focus a little bit, but you keep the momentum, which is so critical.
Yes. I will say though, the key thing about day 5 is that it's very important for you to be aware of the things that are getting in the way. And so I define between common day 5s and current day 5s. So for example, I'm navigating my entrepreneurship journey, and right now I've got a current day 5 factor, which for example might be COVID-19 or a cash flow issue, or the lack of buy-in to my strategy from my team. Now, those things are current day 5s that we have to proactively deal with. Some of those things are out of our control, and some of those things we can actually deal with. But there's also the common day 5s. And I must say, for a lot of entrepreneurs, if you go back over the years, what have been the common things that have tripped you up? And so for me personally, I can say that when I enter into cash flow issues or financial challenges, that's a common day 5 that seems to cause me to want to throw my hands up in the air and enter into victim mentality. If you can identify your common day 5 factors, then you can deal with those far more proactively and to mitigate them, not cropping up, they'll crop up again, but mitigate the way in which they cause you to stumble and fall when they do pitch up in the future.
That's excellent. Okay, so that was insight number 1, really, which if we could summarize that, it's keep going. If we had to look at the second insight, you mentioned we're going to chat about 3.
Yeah, so to go back to the grit definition, Ash, if I stopped there and just said, well, that was it, every day is about keep going, just suck it up. Don't throw your bike down on the floor. Don't give up. Don't throw your hands up in the air. Just keep going. That's perseverance. Yeah. But the grit definition is passion and perseverance. And resilience says it's the bounce back linked to core purpose. And so the day 6 insight is the one that follows. And the insight is who you are will get you there. So refuel from your story. So I'm basically have a firm belief that our story is what fuels our grit. And it's what you mentioned earlier from that sales book that you were reading.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this idea that, and so what happened is when we got to the end of day 5, that night we stayed with a Dominee by the name of Cassie van Wyk. Cassie van den Berg. And Cassie pulled us onto his stoep and he asked us some questions. And the one key question was, what are 2 guys from Durban doing on my stoep? What brought you here? Yeah. And it was an opportunity for us to share our story, the vision of raising money for the kids, the purpose that each of us shared for why we were doing the tour in the first place, and then our core values, that we lived by, that were shaped by the way that we were parented, the way that we were brought up. And the insight for me in that moment was, in the midst of the challenging day 5 circumstances, that stuff had all disappeared. It was as though it had just leaked out, and I'd forgotten about my story completely. So what the power of what Cassie did for us was to catalyze a reconnection with the story, to refuel our grit and resilience and resolve, to refuel our endurance with our purpose and our vision and our values. And my insight here is that in the midst of tough terrain, we forget this stuff. And as entrepreneurs or as people, we have to reconnect intentionally with why we're doing what we're doing, what we're looking to achieve, and the core values which are driving us, because that underpins our ability to endure in the long term.
And that's interesting. I think the key points you made there were purpose, vision, values. I know in exercise as an entrepreneur, one of the things we almost don't enjoy doing after we've been in business for a while is doing business plans. And it's actually not a bad idea to revisit those business plans and actually physically write down purpose, vision, values and readdress it, even if it's just to remind ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the principle that we teach in the midst of this insight, especially for us as business people, is how do you, or what does Cassie stoep look like for you? How do you intentionally sit on the stoep and reconnect with those things? Ash, so spot on. And I think it's great practice to, even if it's quarterly, to look at that strategy, to remind ourselves why we're doing it, to go back to purpose, vision, and values. And the interesting thing that day six from an environmental point of view was harder than day 5. There was added extras like rain and lightning. But we rode connected to our story, which made that day easier than day 5. And so the principle that I try and kind of work with people on this one is, are you riding connected to your story? Are you doing each day of entrepreneurship connected to your story? Are you doing each day of your marriage connected to your story? And how do you refuel that? How do you reconnect with that story? Otherwise, it's just about the hamster wheel. It's just about the spinning kind of thing of getting to the end.
Yeah, and I suppose that story is important, not just for you as the entrepreneur and owner, but that needs to filter right down to your entire team, not just yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great opportunity, Ash. Great point. Because if we can get our organizations or our businesses to connect with, we call it our brand DNA. So our brands have got a strategy, but they've also got a DNA. Why do we exist? What are we looking to achieve? What are our core values? The trick is to take those things off the wall and to ensure that they're actually inculcated into our staff. So how do we create space for them to emotionally connect with those things so that they're riding connected to our story on a daily basis as well? Because in essence, what we're looking to do is we're looking to make decisions that are based from our story, because resilience is about maintaining integrity. It's about maintaining a connection to core purpose. We want our people underneath us as well, or around us rather, to also be making decisions connected to our story, because then we're all making decisions that are driving a collective story. And that's the kind of key principle here.
And Trav, you work in the corporate space, so I'm sure you must see a lot of companies at this time saying we need to chase after the sales or chase after money, when actually we actually need to do almost the opposite.
Yeah, so I mean, a very quick principle here to help with resilience is actually to differentiate between what we call transactional communication and transformational communication. And very, very quickly, the transactional communication is the communication that we need to have to get the job done. So this is what we found in organizations, like 90% of our communication, sometimes 100%, is all about what are we doing, how are we getting there, what's happening with that supplier, with that customer, KPIs, et cetera, et cetera. But transformational communication is the communication that we need to shape and sustain a healthy culture. And it's the conversations that we need to have to reconnect with our story. And for many businesses and business leaders, they deem transformational communication to be irrelevant and a waste of time, because the transactional conversations are the ones that count. But if we want businesses that are enduring businesses and that have grit and resilience for tough times, and this was proven in COVID, many organizations that had spent a lot of time fostering the type of culture pre-COVID were able to leverage that culture to navigate and to endure through COVID. They had resilience because they were connected to core purpose. And so it's not a waste of time, it's an absolute necessity.
And I think that's going to be even more challenging than ever with people working remotely, and you don't have that natural team environment. There probably needs to be more emphasis on it than ever, I think.
Yeah, and I think we've raised the consciousness of that, so I think all of us have raised the level of awareness that in order to fuel our own endurance, we need to be connected to our story. We've got the added privilege of being believers who get to draw on the word and what the word says about us. So being connected to the right scriptures and to the core things that God has said. And then, of course, we get to translate that into our family. So I've even found that within my own family, we're more reconnected to story, and we're bringing habits and behaviors back into play that we're missing. And for organizations, it's going to be the same thing.
Brilliant. Okay, so that was insight number 2, which was basically refueling your story, if we could put in that perspective or context. If we had to choose one more insight out of the 7, what would that be?
Yeah, so I like to share the Dave 315 because it takes us up into Africa, and it actually takes us out of the bicycle and onto a bus. So if I can quickly just share the story with you, Ash. So it's this idea of the insight is what we focus on expands, protect our perspective. And to cut a long story short, we had an incident in Malawi where we had to take a bus 200 kilometers between 2 towns. It was due to a shortage of water and whatnot. And this bus was a very interesting bus in that it was very old and dilapidated, but it was an exceptionally exciting journey to be on, because these African bus trips seemed to be full of energy. And when the buses were coming towards you, you could see their 2 front tires and their 2 back tires because their axles were so skewed.
I'm almost picturing it as you're speaking.
I've got an image of it, I should share it. But what was interesting, it was a condensed version of the broader tour, and that we got onto this bus and we started the journey and we were excited about it. 45 minutes in, we actually left the road and we were going through such a bumpy section that we were bouncing on top of each other. And the high good emotions became low emotions, where we went from being excited about something into being frustrated by something. So think about the entrepreneurship journey again. We start, we're good, then we move down, and we found ourselves in challenging circumstances and we're frustrated. Then we ended up on a plateau and there was beautiful wildlife around us. And so from being frustrated, we moved back up to being content. Then we had to summit from one plateau to another plateau up a hairpin mountain pass. And halfway up this mountain pass, this bus driver stalled the bus and the bus started rolling back towards the edge of the cliff. And 2-3 attempts at trying to get this bus to start, this bus was just rolling back towards the cliff. And I went down into a space of absolute fear. I was starting to look to kick out the back window, but there were bars across the window. The bus was so full. There was chickens, there was livestock, there was people. So to get out the front of the bus was difficult. And eventually on the 4th time, he managed to move this bus and we ended up carrying on. This 200K bus journey took 9 hours. But the interesting thing is that whilst I moved down to fear, there was a woman sitting next to me who was very calm and content. She sat there, she was actually breastfeeding her child. She had no worries, whereas me sitting next to her was flailing and flying around in crisis mode. So the point of this little story is that it's not the environmental circumstances that determine the emotions. Yeah. Resilience and grit and endurance and resolve are basically an ecosystem of developing the right emotions that are going to take us through. It's mental and emotional strength. If we allow the environmental circumstances to push us into negative emotions, then essentially what we're saying is that we're at the mercy of the environment. And many people live as a mirror to what's going on. So if the environment's good, they're good. If the environment's negative, they're negative. Endurance can't be a product of a good environmental circumstance. Endurance needs to be displayed in the midst of challenging times as well. And my insight on that bus was that the difference between me and that woman was the way we saw the situation, our perspective. And I've been in many scenarios, and when you mentioned that we were in Thailand and we experienced the tsunami, that was a great example of a bunch of people on an island experiencing the same environmental circumstance, but based on their perspective, deploying a different set of emotions and a different strategy to navigate through it. So if you think about your businesses, if you think about your teams, you all experience the same environmental challenges, but the emotions are diverse because the way that people see those situations is very different. So this insight day 315 is about protecting your perspective and being very clear on auditing exactly what you're paying attention to, being very clear on eradicating the things that you shouldn't be paying attention to. And I'm not promoting ignorance here and ignoring, but being clear on what you pay attention to and what you don't pay attention to. And then as a leader, especially influencing the narrative that exists within your organization and your team, because that narrative will influence perspective and therefore emotions and therefore overall endurance and resilience and grit that's needed.
Sure, that's excellent. I think as business owners, again, it's quite easy to take one of two approaches. You can listen to a lot of negativity, and the media really punts a lot of that these days, or you can put your head in the sand. But it's not really either, right? It's actually about it's basically siphoning or auditing, as you say, auditing what information you actually want to take in and use, and then almost reframing it into your perspective.
Yeah, and Ash, I must say, I think this one, especially for us as entrepreneurs and for those of us especially who lead teams, we have to acknowledge the fact that the world currently is throwing a lot of narrative at us. I mean, just think about the social challenges that are going on right now. So I don't think we can lead anymore in industry and not be able to engage and influence narrative. We've got to be able to disseminate the things that are outside of our businesses, because that stuff it comes into our industries, it comes into the four walls of our organization. And old school leadership was very much about leaving your emotions at the door. But now we've got to consider how emotions actually play a role in supporting our ability to create sustainable businesses. And with the amount of stuff influencing people's emotions, from social media to the news, we've got to be prayed up, we've got to be aware, we've got to be engaging in these narratives and create space to have those conversations in the workplace.
For sure. So if I was a business owner right now going through a tough time, listening to this, I'll be going, wow, this is amazing information. I'll probably be wanting more and wish this was a longer interview. But if I was listening to this and saying, okay, this is great, Trav, but how do I apply these principles? Would be almost a starting point and some take-homes that one could take from today's interview.
Yeah, so I think a summary for me would be the first thing is to actually sit down and just say this to yourself. I am made for tough terrain. Know that anything God made is made for tough terrain. That's the reality. and believe in your ability to draw on more endurance and more grit and resilience, because you actually have an incredible amount within you that can take you forward. And then I think practically I'd work through those 3 insights. So for me, I'd go, what are the current day 5 factors that I'm facing? What are the environmental circumstances that are challenging? Which ones can I control? Which ones can't I control? And then how can I proactively deal with the ones that I can? Pausing there to then also go back over our historical kind of data of day 5s and ask some questions around some common day 5s. And is there anything that keeps tripping me up that I actually need to deal with in my life right now? So that would be my starting point. And then I would flank that with the day 6 principle, where I'd sit intentionally on the stoep, picture Uamkasi next to you, and go, right, let me reboot and reconnect with purpose, vision, and values. Why am I doing this? What am I doing it for? And what are the core values that I'm deploying? And then within that, I would then go back to the last one and go, okay, well, let me do an audit on what I'm paying attention to. I mean, there's that analogy, it's very cliched analogy about that kid that goes to his father and says, these 2 packs of wolves that are fighting in my head, the good pack, the bad pack, which one wins? And the father says, well, whichever you feed. So what are you feeding in your life right now, and how is that influencing your emotions? And that can be done on a piece of paper. I mean, to list the day 5s, to list that story, and to audit your perspective. Just deploying those 3 insights from a practical point of view should shift you into a new trajectory and fuel your ability to endure whatever it is that's been thrown your way.
That's brilliant, Trav. There's already been a lot of insights you provided. So in order to assist all those that are watching this video live, or those that are watching the recording, we've chatted about offering a virtual workshop on this Friday at 10 o'clock. So I'm super excited about that, actually digging into this a little bit more and really helping people at a practical level. Can you run us through just a little bit about what you're going to be covering on Friday's workshop and what people can expect?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'd like to create some space for people to first and foremost just articulate the kind of journey that they have started or are walking. There's a lot of people in the midst of COVID that have started new journeys, Ash. Whether it's a pivot or whether it's out of forced necessity because they've been laid off or whatever it is. So let's consider our journeys. We're all in the middle together, which is really exciting. And then I'll create some space for us to actually articulate some day 5s and to share those with each other, because when we hear about other people's day 5s and how they're navigating it, it often helps us navigate our own day 5s. And so doing this together, one of the 7 insights is all about the idea of our tribe. So doing this together, it's like a mini tribe for a small period of time. And then we'll look at some proactive ways to deal with that. And then I think we'll dive a little bit more into purpose, vision, and values, Ash, because whilst those terms are common, they're often misunderstood. So I'll probably just give people a few handles on how do you actually articulate purpose, vision, and values for yourself? And what do those words even mean? And how do we get them to a point where we can actually use them on a daily basis? And then I think that will probably take up the hour. If we've got some time, we could have a look at some of the perspective stuff as well, and I can layer that with a bit more insight and give people some space to actually do a bit of an audit on their perspective as well.
Brilliant. Well, I'm super excited to find out more and be part of that workshop. I'm also an avid business book reader, so I'm definitely going to be getting a copy of your book. Trav, the book, The Middle, where can we get that? I'm keen to get a copy myself.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, it's a published book, so it is found in exclusives and other bookstores. It is also on Amazon. I can send you the link. But if anybody wants a copy directly from me, I mean, I've got a bunch here in Durban. There's some drop-off points in some coffee shops. They can just email me at travis@themiddle.co.za, and I'll happily get them one.
Awesome. Trav, thanks so much for your time today. I've learned a lot, and we all appreciate the time that you're providing and the difference that you're making in the city. And we look forward to
great. I appreciate it. Nice to be with you all again.